Good evening, everyone. Today we're diving deeper into the realm of real life horror. We'll be sharing more chilling tales based on true events. Before we begin, for our appreciation and encouragement of our hard work, please hit that like button and subscribe to support our channel. We're always on the lookout for new, terrifying stories. If you have a bone chilling experience to share, please reach out. Your story might be featured in a future episode. The cold was relentless, biting into the skin and seeping through the thin fabric of their uniforms. The wind howled down from the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush, a mountain range that seemed to swallow sound itself, leaving behind only the eerie silence that hung like a pall over the forward operating base. It was a desolate outpost perched on the edge of a cliff, miles away from any other human presence. It wasn't the kind of place you'd want to find yourself alone, let alone stationed for months on end. But for Staff Sergeant John Grayson and his men, this was reality. Grayson had been in Afghanistan long enough to know that the terrain was unforgiving. His previous deployments had taken him to the farthest reaches of the country Helmand, Kandahar, and the valleys of Paktia, but nothing compared to the oppressive isolation of this mountain outpost. The base had been established to monitor insurgent activity, but the real threat here wasn't just the enemy, it was the mountains themselves, with their winds that could freeze a man's bones in minutes, the unpredictable weather, and, as they would soon find out, something far darker. The first few days were uneventful, but as Grayson and his men settled into their routines, they began to notice things. Small things at first, footsteps in the snow when no one had walked there, strange shadows in the corners of their tents, and whispers carried on the wind that sounded like voices calling their names. Grayson wasn't the kind of leader to dismiss such things lightly. He'd seen enough combat, enough hardship to know that fear could play tricks on the mind, but something about the place felt off. The whispers, for example, weren't the kind of thing you'd expect to hear in a war zone. It wasn't the occasional sound of distant gunfire or the rattle of a helicopter overhead. These whispers were personal, specific. They seemed to be calling his name. The soldiers would gather around the fire at night, the flickering light casting long shadows across the snow. They'd talk about the day's patrol, about their families back home, and the things they missed most, like a cold beer or a warm bed. It was a routine that helped break the tension, but one night, something unusual happened. Private Jameson, a rookie who had been serving with Grayson for only a few months, broke the silence. You hear that Jameson's voice was barely a whisper. Grayson looked up from his pack of cards, his eyes scanning the horizon, but there was nothing unusual, just a barren landscape stretching out into infinity. The snow was still untouched by human foot, and the stars above gleamed cold and distant. Hear what Private Grayson asked, his tone casual, though there was a gnawing unease starting to form in the pit of his stomach. The voices, Jameson said, his voice trembling. Grayson stood up and walked toward the young soldier, his boots crunching against the frozen earth. Voices, he asked. What are you talking about? Jameson's eyes were wide, darting nervously toward the mountains. They're calling my name. I swear to God I can hear them out there, in the dark. The others chuckled, thinking it was just nerves. It was common for soldiers to imagine things when they were isolated for long stretches in places like this. But Grayson wasn't so sure. He'd spent enough time in the field to know that it was easy for the mind to play tricks. But the unease that had been growing inside him since they arrived only deepened. He turned and stared out into the mountains, his gaze lingering on the silhouettes of the peaks against the night sky. It wasn't the first time something strange had happened. A few days earlier, Sergeant Myers had complained of hearing footsteps outside his tent at night, though when he checked, no one was there. Private Thompson had woken up in the middle of the night, his body drenched in sweat, saying he'd dreamed of being chased by something, a shadow. a figure with glowing eyes, but there were no answers, no explanation. The men passed it off as stress, but Grayson knew better than to ignore such things. Maybe you're just tired, Grayson said to Jameson. It's been a long few days. Get some rest. But Jameson didn't seem convinced. He kept glancing nervously at the mountains, his face pale under the harsh light of the fire. Over the next few days, the situation only worsened. The whispers became more frequent, and the soldiers began to experience vivid, unsettling dreams. Dreams of being trapped in the mountains, chased by something they couldn't see, but could feel something ancient and malevolent, something that didn't belong in this world. Then came the storm. It hit without warning. One moment, the sky was clear, the air cold but manageable, and the next, the wind picked up, a fierce gust that howled down from the peaks, carrying with it a snowstorm, so thick it reduced visibility to almost nothing. The soldiers huddled inside their tents, trying to keep warm as the blizzard raged outside. Grayson sat in his tent, staring at the dim glow of his lantern, wondering how long it would take before they could resume their patrols. They couldn't stay holed up in this base forever. That's when the radio crackled to life. Grayson jumped, his heart racing. He hadn't expected any transmissions, especially not during a storm. Grayson, do you copy? The voice on the other end was distorted, barely audible over the static. But there was something familiar about it, something chilling. Grayson, do you copy? This is Captain Malik. Grayson's breath caught in his throat. There was no Captain Malik in their unit. In fact, he didn't recognize the name at all. His heart skipped a beat, and a shiver ran down his spine. He grabbed the receiver, his hands shaking as he held it to his ear. This is Staff Sergeant Grayson, he said, his voice steady despite the growing dread in his chest. Who is this? What's going on? There was a long pause before the voice on the radio answered, but when it did, it was barely more than a whisper. Don't go up there, it said. It's not safe. They're watching. The transmission ended abruptly, the radio cutting to static. Grayson stared at the receiver in disbelief, his mind racing. Who had that been? And what did they mean by their watching? The next morning, after the storm had passed, the base was eerily quiet. The usual sounds, the distant rumble of helicopters, the crackle of radio chatter were all gone. It was as if the storm had stripped the world of all life, leaving only the desolate whiteness of the snow covered mountains. Grayson tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over him, but it was difficult. The radio transmission from the night before weighed heavily on his mind. He tried to dismiss it as a prank or a malfunction, but something about it felt too real, too urgent. Too. That day, a small patrol was sent out to investigate the area beyond the base. They were tasked with checking out a series of caves that had been reported as potential hideouts for insurgents. The soldiers, despite their growing unease, were professional enough to follow orders. When they didn't return by nightfall, Grayson and the others began to grow concerned. A search party was formed, and after hours of trekking through the treacherous terrain, they found nothing. No signs of a struggle, no footprints leading off the trail, just a torn radio lying in the snow and a set of boot prints that stopped abruptly at the base of a steep cliff. The tracks didn't lead anywhere, they just ended, as if the soldiers had vanished into thin air. The Khyber Pass was a choke point, a narrow corridor of land stretching between Pakistan and Afghanistan that had seen more bloodshed than anyone cared to remember. For centuries, it had been a crossroads for armies, traders, and warlords, each leaving their mark on the land, some of them never leaving at all. For Captain Alex Mercer and his squad of soldiers, it was just another mission, another outpost to secure in the never ending struggle against insurgents. The base was nothing more than a collection of makeshift tents and rusted vehicles, perched on the side of a jagged cliff that overlooked the pass. It was surrounded by nothing but the stark beauty of the rugged mountains, the kind of terrain that felt both majestic and suffocating, as though the mountains themselves were watching. Mercer had served in the region long enough to know that nothing was ever simple in Afghanistan. This was a land of secrets old, forgotten ones, and that had always unsettled him more than the ever present threat of gunfire or IEs. The first night in the outpost felt like any other. The usual sounds, winds howling through the passes, the distant crackle of radio chatter, and the murmur of soldiers keeping to themselves filled the cold air. The men had set up their perimeter, checked the ammunition, and established a rotation for guard duty. Sergeant Walker, one of the veterans in the squad, leaned over to Mercer as they shared a cigarette outside the makeshift command tent. "Have you heard the stories about this place?" Walker asked, his voice low. "The locals believe this pass is cursed." Mercer raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond right away. Walker had always been one to talk about superstitions, his way of coping with the constant stress of the deployment. "What kind of curse?" Mercer asked, half expecting another one of Walker's exaggerated stories. "The kind that makes men disappear," Walker said, his voice thick with something close to fear. "The kind that leaves no trace. They say you'll hear whispers in the night, voices calling your name, and if you're not careful, something will drag you into the mountains. Some of the older soldiers at the last base I was at, they'd heard about it too. They called it the shadow of the Khyber." Mercer chuckled, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right about this place. The isolation, the oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed different here, colder, more unnatural. He tried to shake off the unease. It was just paranoia. There was nothing supernatural about the Khyber Pass. But that night, as the moon hung high and the wind picked up, Mercer couldn't help but feel as though something was watching him. The first signs of something wrong came 2 days later. Private Ethan Hayes, a young soldier who had only been in country for a few months, went missing during a routine patrol. He had been assigned to the outer perimeter watch, a solitary post that overlooked a narrow gorge on the far side of the base. At first, the squad assumed he had gone to relieve himself, but after hours passed with no word, panic set in. They sent out a search party to find him. Hayes was nowhere to be found. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away from his post. It was as if he had simply vanished. Mercer couldn't explain it, and neither could anyone else. The only clue they found was a set of footprints leading toward the base of the cliffs, but when they tried to follow them, they vanished abruptly, just like Hayes. The tracks didn't continue. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. After hours of searching, the squad returned to base, tired and on edge. The wind had picked up again, carrying with it an unsettling hum. The sound seemed to reverberate off the cliffs, echoing across the valley. "Maybe he just wandered off," Private Jennings suggested, though there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice. "Not like that," Mercer muttered. "Something's wrong." That night, Mercer couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the missing soldier, about the strange emptiness of the cliffs. His eyes kept darting toward the edge of the camp, where the shadows seemed darker than they should be, even under the moonlight. It was then that he heard it, a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. "Alex." He stiffened, listening. His heart raced. The voice sounded so real, so close. "Mercer." The sound of his name was followed by the faintest rustle, as though someone were standing just outside the tent, waiting for him to react. He grabbed his rifle and crawled out of his sleeping bag, but there was no one there, just the empty, howling wind. The following days were a blur of confusion and growing tension. Hayes was still missing, and the men were jumpy, looking over their shoulders as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the dark. The whispers grew louder. Mercer wasn't sure if it was fatigue or something else, but the whispers seemed to come from everywhere. His radio would crackle in the middle of the night with voices calling his name. His eyes would dart toward the cliffs, only to see nothing but the outline of the rocks against the sky. And then there were the dreams. Each night he dreamt of walking alone through the Khyber Pass, the wind biting at his skin, the shadows moving in the corners of his vision. In the dream he would hear his voice pleading for help, but when he tried to find him, the voice would disappear, replaced by laughter, dark, mocking laughter. One night, as Mercer stood guard on the perimeter, he saw something move near the cliffs. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, the wind shifting the shadows. But then, out of the darkness, something emerged. A figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, with a face hidden by a hood, its body draped in tattered, ancient-looking clothing. The figure stood still, watching him from the edge of the cliff. Its presence felt oppressive, like an invisible weight pressing down on him. "Who's there?" Mercer called out, his voice tight with fear. "Show yourself." The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its gaze fixed on him. The whispers grew louder, now forming words. "He is coming. He is coming for you all." Before Mercer could react, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The next day, a second soldier, Corporal Smith, went missing. This time there were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, only an eerie silence. The soldiers were beginning to panic. They'd lost 2 men, and they were trapped in the Khyber Pass with whatever was haunting them. The whispers were no longer just in their heads, they were real. They were coming from the mountains, calling their names, luring them into the dark. By the time the rest of the unit decided to leave, it was too late. The pass had claimed them. One by one, they were drawn into the shadows, as if something was waiting for them, something older than time itself. Mercer was the last to hear the whispers. They called to him, promising that he would never leave, that the Khyber Pass would be his eternal home. But he was determined to survive, determined to fight against whatever force had taken his men. But when the rescue team arrived days later, all they found was an empty base, no sign of Mercer, no sign of anyone. Just the wind and the echoes of forgotten voices calling from the mountains. They say the Khyber Pass is cursed, and no one who ventures too deep into its heart ever comes back. The shadow of the Khyber is always watching.